Right now, on February 24th, 2026, two American aircraft carrier strike groups are sitting within striking distance of Iran. And the question every serious analyst is asking isn't whether the U.S. military can hit Iran. It can. Everyone knows it can. The real question, the one being argued inside the White House right now, is what happens to the global economy the morning after the first strike lands. Because here's the number nobody in mainstream media is centering this story around. $6 trillion. That is the estimated total economic exposure. That figure represents what happens if this conflict triggers a full disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile bottleneck through which 20% of the world's daily oil flows. Not $300 billion, not even $1 trillion. $6 trillion sitting at risk the moment the first munition leaves an American aircraft over Iranian territory. And that number isn't coming from anti-war activists or political opposition economists. It's coming from J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the Dallas Federal Reserve. The same institutions that fund, advise, and manage the financial infrastructure of the United States itself are quietly running these numbers and not liking the output. So today, we're going to break down exactly how that $6 trillion trap works, and why striking Iran may cost far more than anyone in Washington is publicly admitting. Let's start with the most important framing of this entire story. This is not primarily a military crisis. It never was. It is a financial architecture problem dressed up in the language of national security. And once you see it that way, everything else starts making a different kind of sense. Here's what the actual setup looks like as of February 24th, 2026, based on confirmed reporting from Reuters, CNN, and Axios this month. Trump has ordered a significant military buildup near Iran. 2 carrier strike groups, over 300 combat aircraft, and B-2 bombers repositioned to Diego Garcia within range of Iranian targets. At the same time, Trump issued a public deadline, a 10 to 15-day window for Iran to reach a nuclear agreement, or face what he described simply as bad things. The language is vague. The military positioning is not. This is the largest concentration of American air power near Iran since 2003, and the markets have already noticed. Because here's where the financial trap begins to close. The moment that hardware moved into position, oil markets didn't wait for a strike. They started moving immediately. Brent crude, sitting near $64 per barrel in early January 2026, has been climbing steadily on what traders call a war premium, the extra price the market charges for supply disruption risk. Goldman Sachs estimated that war premium at roughly $4 per barrel as of late January. That sounds small, but $4 is the starting point, not the ceiling, not even close to the ceiling. J.P. Morgan's published scenario analysis puts Brent crude at $120 to $130 per barrel in a confirmed Strait of Hormuz disruption scenario. That is the official forecast of the largest U.S. bank. From $64 to $130 is a near doubling of the global oil price. And an oil price doubling doesn't stay contained in the energy sector. It moves through every layer of the economy at once. Inflation, transportation, manufacturing, food production, consumer spending, corporate earnings. Everything connected to energy gets repriced simultaneously, and everything is connected to energy. This is precisely why Trump's own economic advisors, according to Reuters, have been urging him internally to focus on the economy rather than Iran. Not opposition figures, his own team. Now, let's talk about why the Strait of Hormuz specifically is the single most consequential piece of physical geography in the global economy at this moment. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The actual usable shipping lanes, the navigable channels for large vessels, measure roughly 2 miles in each direction. Through those 4 miles of water moves approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day. According to EIA data from early 2025, that's 27% of all seaborne crude traded globally. Add to that 22% of global LNG trade, primarily Qatar's exports, flowing through the same 21-mile corridor, and you're looking at the single largest energy choke point on the planet. Now, here's the part that most mainstream coverage is glossing over entirely. The alternative bypass routes around the strait exist on paper. In reality, they don't come close to covering the volume. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline carries about 5 million barrels per day. The UAE's Fujairah pipeline adds roughly 1.5 million. Combined bypass capacity, approximately 8 million barrels per day. The strait moves 20 million. Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar, collectively responsible for enormous volumes, have no meaningful bypass infrastructure at all. There is no plan B at scale. If the strait closes, or even partially disrupts, that gap between 8 million and 20 million barrels doesn't get filled. Not by pipelines, not by strategic reserves, not by emergency diplomacy. The U.S. holds roughly 600 million barrels in strategic petroleum reserves. Europe holds around 400 million. Asian nations collectively hold over 1 billion. That sounds like a lot. At current global consumption rates, the combined strategic reserve buffer of the entire Western world buys approximately 2 months of coverage against a full strait closure. 2 months. After that, the global economy is running on a supply it cannot replace through any existing alternative. That is not a political opinion. That is a physical infrastructure fact. And this is the trap. This is what $6 trillion actually means when you start building it component by component, from oil shock to market crash to recession math. In my view, this is the core tension driving every conversation happening in the White House right now that we're not being fully briefed on through official channels. The military option is real and executable. The economic consequences of that option are equally real, and they are not within Washington's control to manage after the fact. That gap between what the military can do and what the economy can absorb is where the $6 trillion figure lives. And it's larger than almost anyone in public commentary is acknowledging. If this kind of deep analysis is what you come to this channel for, drop a comment below. Do you think Trump pulls the trigger? Or does the economic math force a deal at the last minute? Hit the like button too. It genuinely helps more people find this content, and it tells me to keep going deeper on stories that actually matter to your financial future. Because in part 2, we're going to build the $6 trillion number component by component. Oil shock, market crash, recession trigger, and the inflation math that nobody wants to say out loud. Here is the number that should be on the front page of every financial newspaper right now. 20 million barrels per day, sitting behind a 21-mile door that Iran holds the key to. And here's what makes that number genuinely alarming for any economist running war scenarios. You don't need to close the strait to trigger a global price shock. You just need to make it feel unsafe. In 1973, Arab nations didn't close a single shipping lane. They announced an embargo. Oil quadrupled in 4 months, and the U.S. economy didn't fully recover for nearly a decade afterward. In 2019, 2 Saudi Aramco facilities were hit by drone strikes, nowhere near the strait. Global oil prices jumped 15% in a single day, the largest one-day spike recorded at that point in history. Now we're talking about potential strikes on Iran itself, the country that physically borders the strait on 3 sides. The price reaction in that scenario is something markets have never fully priced before. So let's build the $6 trillion number the way a serious analyst actually builds it. Not as a rhetorical device, but as a damage accounting exercise, component by component, source by source. Component 1, the direct oil price shock. This is the most immediate piece of the equation, and the numbers here are already on record from major financial institutions. JP Morgan's publicly available scenario analysis puts Brent crude at $120 to $130 per barrel in a confirmed Hormuz disruption scenario. Brent closed near $74 on February 21st, 2026. That move from $74 to $130 is a 56 per barrel increase. The global economy consumes roughly 100 million barrels per day. That math produces $5.6 billion in additional daily energy costs worldwide. Over 1 year, at sustained elevated prices, that's approximately $2 trillion in additional global energy costs, sitting on top of every economy simultaneously. And that's just component 1, the floor, not the ceiling. Because oil doesn't only raise gas prices. Oil is embedded in plastics, fertilizer, shipping, aviation, and heating. Every industry that moves physical goods moves on the back of oil in some form. The Dallas Fed ran a scenario analysis on exactly this question. Their published finding? A full Hormuz disruption drives WTI to $100 per barrel, adding 1.3 percentage points to U.S. annual inflation within 6 months. Here's the detail that makes that inflation number especially dangerous for the American economy right now in February 2026. WTI crude was sitting at roughly $70 per barrel heading into this standoff. U.S. shale producers, the backbone of America's energy independence, need prices above roughly $60 to stay profitable. Below that, they shut down wells. Above $100, domestic inflation returns with full force. That puts the U.S. economy in a narrow $60 to $100 window where energy policy actually functions. A sustained war premium would blow through the top of that window almost immediately upon any confirmed strike. Component 2, the stock market shock. This is the piece that hits American households the fastest, because retirement accounts don't wait for quarterly reports to reflect the damage. Financial analysts modeling a confirmed Iran strike scenario estimate the S&P 500 loses approximately 7% in the immediate aftermath. The Dow drops roughly 3,000 points. The Nasdaq falls harder than both. Total U.S. stock market capitalization sits around $50 trillion as of early 2026. 7% of $50 trillion equals $3.5 trillion in household wealth destroyed within hours of a confirmed strike. Not weeks, hours. That $3.5 trillion doesn't disappear abstractly. It comes directly out of 401k plans, pension funds, and retirement savings, the financial foundation built by American working households over decades. In my view, this is the most politically explosive component of the entire calculation, and it receives the least attention because there's no dramatic visual. Just a red number on a screen erasing years of savings. Component 3, the inflation feedback loop. This is where the damage stops being a one-time shock and becomes a sustained economic drag, the kind that reshapes political coalitions over multiple election cycles. The consumer price index in the United States was running at approximately 3% annually heading into early 2026, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Elevated, but manageable by most assessments. An oil spike to $130 per barrel adds an estimated 2 to 3 percentage points to CPI, based on Federal Reserve historical modeling from previous oil shock episodes. That pushes total inflation toward 5 to 6%. At 5% inflation, U.S. gas prices reach roughly $5.50 to $6 per gallon nationally. Household heating costs rise sharply. Food prices increase by an estimated 15 to 20% as agricultural and transport costs compound. These aren't abstract statistics. They show up on receipts, at gas stations, on utility bills, the specific numbers that shape how voters feel about the economy every single month going into any election. And here is where the Federal Reserve gets trapped inside its own toolkit in a way that has no clean resolution. When inflation rises, the Fed's standard response is to raise interest rates to cool demand. But raising rates into a supply shock doesn't fix the underlying problem. It just layers an economic slowdown on top of the inflation already in motion. That specific combination is what economists call stagflation. Raising rates into a supply shock doesn't fix the problem. It layers an economic slowdown directly on top of the inflation already running. That specific combination is what economists call stagflation. Component 4, the global recession trigger. This is the piece that extends the damage beyond American borders and starts feeding back into the U.S. economy from the outside simultaneously. Sustained oil above $120 per barrel triggers recession conditions in Europe within roughly 2 quarters, based on historical modeling. Germany, already contracting in late 2025, would likely enter a deep recession first. European recession reduces demand for American exports. U.S. corporate earnings fall as multinationals report weaker overseas revenue. The initial stock market decline accelerates beyond the first-day shock number. Japan and South Korea, both almost entirely dependent on Hormuz oil imports, face simultaneous crises. Their currencies weaken. Their central banks face the same impossible policy dilemma the Fed faces. China presents the most structurally significant piece of this global picture. Approximately 25% of China's total oil supply flows through the Strait of Hormuz. A disruption hits its manufacturing base directly. Slower Chinese manufacturing means slower global supply chains. Goods that American consumers buy, electronics, appliances, components, face new shortages and new price pressure on top of existing energy inflation. At this point, the feedback loops start compounding in ways that no single model fully captures. That is precisely why serious total exposure estimates reach into the $6 trillion range across all components combined. At this point, the feedback loops start compounding in ways no single model fully captures. That is precisely why serious total exposure estimates reach into the $6 trillion range when all components are added together. Direct military costs, conservatively $50 billion for a multi-week campaign, based on comparable operations. Oil shock over 1 year, approximately $2 trillion in additional global energy costs stacked on every economy. Stock market wealth destruction in the U.S. alone, $3.5 trillion. Recession-driven GDP contraction, business failures, and rising unemployment add hundreds of billions more in compounding damage across multiple years. $6 trillion is not a worst-case catastrophe projection. Based on available institutional modeling, it is a realistic midpoint estimate if the Strait faces even partial disruption for 6 to 12 months. And here's what makes this moment structurally different from every previous Iran confrontation. The global financial system today is more leveraged and more sensitive to oil shocks than it was in 2003 or even 2019. Debt levels globally are significantly higher than during previous crisis points. Higher debt means higher sensitivity to rising rates, exactly what oil-driven inflation would force the Fed to deliver. The U.S. military can strike Iran. That is not in question. But the U.S. economy cannot absorb the consequences without paying a cost that may structurally exceed anything the strike itself would achieve. That gap between what is militarily executable and what is economically survivable is the real architecture of this story. And it's the tension that explains every signal coming out of Washington this week. Coming up next, we look at who actually benefits when oil hits $130. Not everyone loses when crude doubles. And the answer reveals which economic interests are quietly pushing in which direction behind the scenes. Here is something almost nobody is saying out loud right now. When oil hits $130 per barrel, there are winners, significant ones, and some of them are closer to this decision than you might expect. Let's start with the most obvious beneficiary, the one with the most direct line into Washington's foreign policy conversation right now. Saudi Arabia's national budget breaks even at roughly $80 per barrel, according to IMF estimates from late 2025. At $74 oil, they're running a deficit. At $130, they are not. At $130 per barrel, Saudi Arabia generates approximately $200 billion in additional annual revenue compared to current prices. That is a generational wealth transfer happening inside a single budget cycle. The same math applies across the Gulf. The UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar all run structurally larger surpluses when crude is elevated. Their sovereign wealth funds grow, their geopolitical leverage expands. Russia is the more complicated case, and the more revealing one. Russia's federal budget is heavily dependent on energy export revenues, and that dependency doesn't disappear under sanctions. After 2022, sanctions forced Russia to sell oil at discounts of $15 to $25 below market. Even at a 20% discount, a $50 per barrel price increase still adds tens of billions annually to export revenues. That dynamic does not require coordination or intent to be financially real. The incentive simply exists, independent of whatever diplomatic statements get made publicly by any party involved. Now, here's the piece that gets very little attention in mainstream coverage. American oil companies are also significant winners when crude prices spike, and the scale is worth examining directly. ExxonMobil reported roughly $36 billion in net profit in 2023 at elevated prices. At $130 crude, that number climbs considerably. The same dynamic plays out across Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and the broader shale sector. U.S. shale generates substantially more free cash flow above $100 oil than at $70. That cash flows into executive compensation, shareholder buybacks, and political donations across both parties at every election cycle. In my view, this doesn't mean energy companies are lobbying for conflict. That claim would be unsupported. What it means is that the financial incentives here aren't aligned the way a casual observer might assume. The people most economically harmed by $130 oil are not in the energy industry. They are consumers, households, and small businesses, the voters whose economic anxiety defined the last two American elections. The OOA estimates every 1 cent increase in national gas prices costs American consumers about $4 million per day. A move from $3.50 to $6 per gallon extracts roughly $10 billion per month from household budgets. That $10 billion monthly doesn't fund public programs or infrastructure. It flows to producers, sovereign funds, and commodity traders, a direct transfer of purchasing power away from the American middle class. This is the hidden distributional story inside the oil price shock. The aggregate damage number is $6 trillion, but underneath that aggregate sits a massive redistribution from consumers toward producers. Now let's look at the one beneficiary that is the most counterintuitive given where it sits geographically in this conflict. China imports roughly 25% of its total oil through the Strait of Hormuz. A disruption would hurt China's economy in the short term. That's accurate. But China holds the world's largest strategic petroleum reserve, estimated above 900 million barrels as of 2025 reporting. That buffer buys China roughly 90 days of import coverage. China has also spent a decade building overland pipelines, Power of Siberia, the Central Asia network, specifically to reduce its Hormuz dependency. What this means is that China can absorb a Hormuz disruption significantly better than Japan, South Korea, or most of Europe, all of whom have far less reserve capacity and far fewer alternative supply routes available. In my view, this asymmetry is not accidental. It reflects deliberate infrastructure investment by Beijing aimed at reducing the leverage that Hormuz geography gives Washington in any direct confrontation involving Iran. And there's one more layer here that almost no financial coverage is connecting to the military story. What happens to the dollar itself when a major supply shock hits global oil markets? Oil is priced globally in US dollars. When oil prices spike, global demand for dollars increases because more dollars are needed to purchase the same physical volume of energy traded each day. That temporarily strengthens the dollar, making U.S. exports more expensive, raising debt burdens on developing nations, and tightening financial conditions across emerging markets all at once. This is the paradox at the center of the oil question. The U.S. is simultaneously the world's largest oil producer, largest oil consumer, and the issuer of the currency in which oil is globally priced. A price spike punishes American consumers through higher energy costs, rewards producers through higher revenues, and strengthens the dollar in ways that create new global pressures, all running simultaneously. What this suggests is that the $6 trillion figure is not only a cost, It is a redistribution mechanism, and who sits on which side of it shapes how much weight economic warnings actually carry inside the decision room. The winners are concentrated and politically connected. The losers are diffuse, feeling the damage gradually at the pump, on the grocery receipt, in the quarterly retirement account statement. That asymmetry between concentrated winners and diffuse losers is part of why economic arguments against military action don't automatically win the internal debate, even when the aggregate numbers are overwhelming. Coming up next, what Iran actually controls inside the strait, not the diplomatic version. The specific geographic and military tools that make the economic threat real rather than theoretical. Here is the question nobody in mainstream coverage is asking directly. If the economic case against striking Iran is this overwhelming, why hasn't that argument already won inside the White House? The answer reveals something important about how major foreign policy decisions actually get made, and it has very little to do with the economic models sitting on advisors' desks. Let's start with the geography, because the physical reality of the strait is more constraining than most people realize, and it shapes every option currently on the table. Iran dominates the northern coastline of the strait for nearly its entire length. Every vessel transiting passes within range of Iranian shore-based missile systems for the full duration of the crossing. U.S. defense analysts note Iran has spent 2 decades hardening those coastal systems, embedding batteries into mountainsides, dispersing launch sites, and building underground facilities that are hard to destroy cleanly. Iran also holds an estimated 6,000 naval mines, per defense assessments updated in 2025. You don't need to deploy all of them to close the strait economically. You need enough to make maritime insurers pull coverage. Once insurers pull coverage, tanker captains stop transiting. No insurance means no transit. No transit means no oil flow. And Iran doesn't need to fire a single weapon to produce that economic outcome. This is what defense planners call sea denial. And it is the core reason why a military strike on Iran doesn't automatically end the economic problem. In realistic scenarios, it begins it. A strike on nuclear facilities does not remove Iran's ability to threaten the strait. Those are 2 separate target sets, 2 separate military problems, requiring 2 separate campaign plans simultaneously. Here is where the military logic and the economic logic converge in a way that's rarely explained clearly. The strike itself is not the economic event. The Iranian response to the strike is the economic event. Iran's strategic doctrine, per U.S. and allied analysts, does not rely on matching American air power. It relies on raising the cost of the morning after to a level that makes the original objective feel insufficient. Mines in the strait, fast boat swarms against tankers, missile strikes on Gulf infrastructure, proxy activations across the region. None of these require a conventional military victory to be economically destructive. In that sense, the $6 trillion trap doesn't require Iran to win a war. It requires Iran to make the war expensive enough that economic damage exceeds whatever military objective the strikes actually achieved. That calculation, not the initial strike, but the sustained cost of what follows, is what Trump's economic advisors are reportedly focused on. And it has no clean military solution available. Now let's look at where things actually stand diplomatically as of February 24th, 2026, because the diplomatic and military tracks are running simultaneously, and the gap between them is narrowing. According to Reuters, CNN, and Axios reporting this month, Iran has been engaged in back-channel negotiations. The Trump administration set 4 core deliverable requirements for any acceptable nuclear agreement. Those requirements reportedly include strict enrichment limits, intrusive inspection access, constraints on ballistic missiles, and a verifiable end to weaponization research, all simultaneously and permanently. Iran has historically resisted all 4 conditions at once. The 2015 JCPOA achieved partial progress on enrichment and inspections, but explicitly excluded missiles and was time-limited rather than permanent. What Trump is reportedly demanding goes beyond the 2015 framework in scope and permanence. What Iran is reportedly willing to offer falls short of those demands. That gap is where the risk currently lives. Kushner and Witkoff, the lead negotiators, have reportedly argued internally that progress is real and more time is needed. Their position reflects the core economic logic. A deal costs less than a war by any measure, but the military posture already deployed creates pressure in the opposite direction. 2 carrier strike groups don't stay on station indefinitely without costs that eventually demand resolution one way or another. In my view, this is the structural trap that makes this moment different from previous standoffs. The buildup has created a timeline, and timelines under military pressure tend to resolve in one direction. Now, here's what the historical record says about situations that structurally resemble this one, because the pattern is more consistent than any individual case might suggest on its own. In 1991, and again in 2003, buildups that analysts viewed as pressure tactics ultimately resulted in military action. Economic warnings were present in the debate both times. The military logic prevailed both times. The Iraq War cost an estimated $2 trillion in direct spending, per Brown University's Costs of War project, not counting macroeconomic spillover or long-term veteran care obligations that continue to this day. Iran is not Iraq. The Iranian state is more capable, the geography more constraining, the potential for regional escalation structurally higher, given the proxy networks developed since 2003. What this suggests is that the $6 trillion economic damage floor may be a conservative midpoint, not an alarmist ceiling, when measured against what the historical record shows about sustained regional conflicts. Now let's look at the three scenarios analysts are currently modeling, because the outcome is not binary, and the range matters for understanding where the economic risk actually sits. Scenario 1, a deal is reached. Iran submits a proposal meeting enough of Washington's requirements for a pause. Military posture is maintained, but strikes are deferred. Oil markets stabilize and the war premium fades. Scenario 2, a prolonged standoff. Enough diplomatic movement delays action, but no final agreement is reached. Oil stays elevated at $85 to $95, adding hundreds of billions in global energy costs with no shots fired. Scenario 3, negotiations collapse and military action follows. Iran activates straight denial capabilities in response. Oil moves toward $120 to $130 within days, and the full economic cascade begins its sequence. In my assessment, Scenario 2 is the most probable near-term outcome. Not because diplomacy is succeeding cleanly, but because neither side has yet fully exhausted its leverage or its incentives to avoid strikes. But Scenario 2 is not stable indefinitely. It is a pause, not a resolution. Pauses under military pressure with hardened positions on both sides have a historical tendency to eventually tip in one direction. Here is the final point, and in my view, the most important one to take away from everything covered across this entire story. The $6 trillion trap is not a prediction. It is a measurement of the stakes. It is the honest accounting of what the global economy has sitting on the table in a 21-mile stretch of water. That decision will be made by a small number of people without cameras, shaped by intelligence, military advice, and a president who has historically trusted his own instincts over institutional caution. What the $6 trillion figure does is establish the floor on the cost of being wrong. Whatever objective gets achieved militarily, the economic bill that follows starts there and compounds, depending on what comes next. That is not an argument for any specific policy outcome. Reasonable analysts disagree about whether the security objectives justify those costs. Those are legitimate debates with real arguments on multiple sides. What is not debatable is the arithmetic. J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, the Dallas Federal Reserve, and the EIA are not known for political bias. They are known for getting the numbers right. And their numbers say that the Strait of Hormuz is simultaneously a military problem, a diplomatic problem, and an energy problem. All three at once, with no clean solution available for any one of them in isolation. The decisions made in the coming weeks will determine which version of that arithmetic the global economy actually has to live with. And that outcome matters well beyond the borders of any single country involved. If this story gave you a clearer picture of what's really at stake, drop a comment below. What plays out? A deal, a strike, or a prolonged standoff nobody wins cleanly? Subscribe, because this story is far from over,